Welcome back to our C-Suite series. In this installment titled Legacy and Beyond Visionary CEOs, we venture beyond the corporate facade to uncover the personal triumphs, trials, and transformations of remarkable leaders. These individuals have scaled the peaks of business success and navigated the complex journey of arriving and redefining their life's purpose post-peak career achievements. Today, we're joined by Rahul Pandhi, former CEO of CollabraLink and a distinguished MBA graduate of the Michigan Ross, who led CollabraLink Technologies to new heights in the federal contracting world. Rahul, thank you for being here today as we offer our listeners an intimate glimpse into your life. Could you start by sharing what inspired you to pursue an MBA and enter the federal contracting sector?
Absolutely, Ton. And first of all, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here. I also wanted to note that I think it's such a full circle moment for me because back when I started CollabraLink, and I think it was 2010, I had met you and became a client of your Entellect business. And so it's kind of crazy to me that here we sit 13 or 14 years later, and I'm now being interviewed by you in terms of, kind of having climbed the mountain and now, kind of getting my takes on it. So total full circle moment. So in terms of what motivated me to pursue an MBA and then eventually get into government contracting, those two things were completely unrelated and in fact, almost contradictory. So I went to the University of Michigan to get my MBA specifically because I was very, very fatigued with IT consulting. So pre-MBA, I worked at Accenture. Back then, it was actually called Anderson Consulting when I first joined. So that'll date me a little bit.
Wow, that does go way back.
That's right. But it became Accenture. I climbed the ranks there and just kind of got burnt out on IT. And I thought, I need to do an MBA to kind of understand broader business. And I got, sort of that grounding at Michigan in business strategy, in marketing, in entrepreneurship, and finance and accounting. And I felt, that was a good sort of foundation to have. From there, I pursued strategy consulting. So I didn't get right into government contracting. I didn't get right into entrepreneurship. I became a strategy consultant at a firm called LEK, which was a small boutique that spun out of Bain and Company back in the 80s. And all the work that I did there was purely growth related. So, all of our studies, all of our cases were what new market should we enter? What new what new product should we develop? What new geography should we enter? What company should we buy? These were the questions that we were answering for these clients of ours. And so it was all very growth oriented. But about 2 years in, I was newly married, planning to start a family, and kind of feeling like I was ready for that next segment of my career. And everybody who had left LEK from my office, I was in the Chicago office, that was at my level, sort of post MBA, had transitioned into private equity. And that was my plan all along. I had a plan. I wanted to, sort of follow a blue blood pathway of MBA, strategy consulting, private equity, and I had it all figured out. And in 2008, when I was embarking on that sort of journey of finding a private equity gig, things started going off the rails with the economy. And I think it was Bear Stearns that had collapsed first. Yep. And all of a sudden, all these private equity funds basically just would tell me, hey, come back in a year. We're not hiring, there's no deal flow. Things have really shut down, come back in a year. And I was just crestfallen because I had prepared my whole CV in specific pursuit of this like very blue blood pathway that I thought I was going to go down. And it didn't work and I had to pivot. And right at that moment, I had a conversation with my folks. And my dad said to me, and I remember this very distinctly, my wife and I were back home in the suburbs visiting my parents, and my dad said to me, why don't you come join CollabraLink? And I thought, oh my God, he's crazy. Is he out of his mind? CollabraLink was the mom and pop shop that my dad and mom had started for him to be an independent consultant. And I was just I immediately dismissed the idea, thinking that's absurd. Why would I have spent all this time and energy getting this MBA and kind of building my resume in a certain direction? But then as I kind of left that conversation, and as parents tend to do to their children, he had planted a seed in my head, and I started kind of thinking about it, and I started contemplating, well, what if I joined CollabraLink? And at that point, it was my dad, and he had one employee. And I really started to just think about the scenarios in my head of, well, this is kind of an opportunity for me to try my hand at being an entrepreneur. This is an opportunity for me to spend some quality time with my dad, who at the time was in his mid 60s. And if it
An
didn't,
MBA to use, right? Like you had an MBA, you were highly educated.
right, and put the stuff that I'd learned at Ross to use, and the stuff I'd learned at LEK to use. And so it was like, I always tell people now, as I look back on it, I think my dad played a Jedi mind trick on me. And so, long story short, I very reluctantly joined CollabraLink, which at that time was a commercially focused, sort of, I'd call it IT/process consultancy.
Was it Motorola? I think was one of the main clients at that time, because
Yeah,
you were my client number two.
right.
So I remember those years very vividly. It's like, oh, Motorola, I think.
That's exactly right. Motorola was the main client. It was my dad's former employer before he started CollabraLink, and then he went back there as an independent consultant under the CollabraLink sort of flag. And he had one employee, and we were doing process work for them. And so I got to work just kind of helping him think about, well, how do we grow this thing? And kind of really leveraging that MBA and the strategy consulting work of like, where can we generate revenue? And so we sort of made up a big board, and commercial was the most obvious choice. It was Motorola. We had a few other potential customers in the hopper. And then there was this federal thing that was out there, and I thought, maybe this might be interesting to explore, but not right now. And so we got to work on building a commercial business. But as is true in most any entrepreneur's journey, we got thrown a curveball, and that was the continued sort of decline of the overall economy. So after Bear Stearns collapsed, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and if you remember that time, I mean, it's now referred to as the Great Recession. Basically, everything went off a cliff from an economic perspective. And so Motorola shut down our project midstream. When I joined, I'd helped my dad win a long 1-year project with them. We ramped up to about 3 employees, and 6 months in, they shut it down. And that's when I thought, oh man, I really need to go figure things out here and figure out how we're going to generate revenue. And that's what led us to GovCon, right? So sort of this meandering path that, it didn't start with the intention of building a government contracting business. I mean, I was sitting in Chicago after all. But yeah, that was kind of the sort of precursor to us making a foray into federal. And I started jumping on planes, because the short answer of where do I generate revenue was, well, the only place spending right now is the US federal government, right? That's the only customer that had budget at the time. And so I started jumping on planes coming out to DC. That's when I met you, Tom. And I sort of began to kind of get myself steeped in what does it take? How do you even win a government contract? What does it take to be successful? What are the guys that are having success doing that I can replicate? That's sort of the origin story of CollabraLink and how we got our way into federal way back in that 2009 timeframe.
Yeah, so that's a really great segue into like our first segment, which is the CEO profile. And I remember 2008 vividly. And 2010 was when my son was born. And, with you being my second client, it was one of those make or break, couple of years where you're like, oh my God, am I crazy for doing this? I thought to myself, am I crazy for taking this client on? He had no government experience. He's flying out to Baltimore, and I actually did come across your first original Cape statement.
Oh, no way.
And
I love this.
yes, I will have to send that to you. I forget what title you gave me, but I had a like director for federal contracts type of title to
Yep.
give you a DC presence.
Yep.
And when I look at our work product from back then versus where we are now, we have both come such a long way in both
This
of
is
our
basically,
fields.
like, it's so amazing to me that those very, very sort of meager, beginnings led to something that was just, way bigger than I ever imagined. I mean, it's really, kind of, to me, just inspiring to think back at just how much we were just shooting from the hip and
Yep.
how meager those beginnings were and what it yielded. I mean, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's pretty incredible. And so, but you've matured and you've grown, and CollabraLink saw some really impressive growth. What can you recall or share some strategies that you might have implemented that maybe drove that success? And I know, your father had a huge influence and guidance in that whole, business approach, but what part of his leadership style and um, did you adopt, or did you kind of come up with your own to, be successful? So I'm really trying to get into um, determining what makes a really great CEO, because sometimes, like you said, we kind of stumble on this, by accident, and we kind of mature and develop as, we go along, learn and fail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just start with that last question you asked me first around my dad and what things I learned from his leadership style and his influence. My dad is and he's 80 today, and he's still living a great life with my mom and traveling the world. But my dad is and always has been an eternal optimist. So I remember the first day of my tenure at CollabraLink, my dad turned to me and he goes, "Rahul, we're going to build $100 million business." And I was like, "This guy is crazy. We don't even have like 100,000 of revenue, and he thinks we're going to build $100 million business." And I've always been a very practical, pragmatic, and sometimes people would say even like had a little tinge of pessimism in my
You do.
overall outlook. Yeah, and
You
that's
do.
just how I'm wired. I have a little, maybe it's a healthy sometimes, but unhealthy level of paranoia and anxiety. And my dad is just completely on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I really learned a lot from that, right? Because as a leader, you have to think big, you have to have a big vision, and it's okay for that to be just sort of pie in the sky because that's what you're shooting for. And I'm so glad that he counterbalanced my sort of, kind of more pragmatic style, because it was such a breath of fresh air to have somebody on the team that was just like, no, we're going to make something huge out of this, and I'm confident in that. So that was like the key thing that I really got from my dad. And then he also sort of never it wasn't even like I could term it as this when it was during that period, but now looking back, he had a lot of grit. It was
Yeah.
sort of just like, oh, that didn't work. The thing that we tried, let's go try this other thing. Like it was kind of like ho hum, like let's just keep going, heads down, just keep cranking away at it. And so I also took a lot of that and implemented that in my leadership journey. But now there was like, in addition to that, right? You asked about some of the other strategies that we implemented, and there were some very pure play tactical things that I did that I want to relay to the audience that led to success. I mean, number one, I built relationships. I came out to DC, I ran around the Beltway and tried to build relationships with, big primes, tried to build
Mhm.
relationships with the federal agency OSDBU offices. I tried to build relationships with successful small business owners so I could get some mentorship. So I sort of really was hyper focused on, building those relationships and not being, pesky or annoying, but instead being like just, very deliberate and intentional with their time and with the way that I approached it. And that helped a ton because as a result of that, I found a bunch of mentors who had had success and I could pick their brain. I built relationships with some of these large primes in order to get, some contract experiences. And in fact, the
Mhm.
large prime, and I call them large prime, the software company that I built the tightest relationships with was Appian. And back then, Appian was this small, very like fledgling startup. But I built a relationship with one of their VPs who ran their professional services division, and that yielded fruits. And so that was key for me, building relationships. The second thing was I had a plan, right? But I was very flexible or adapt. Like that plan could be shape shifted and adapted. And so, my plan was, kind of go out, get a GSA schedule, get an 8A, sort of find deals that were within our wheelhouse, which at the time was like process and process automation, and that meant Appian, and then see where that took me. So I had a plan, but then sometimes that would take a right turn, and I would just adapt and follow accordingly. But it was important to me, and I think it's important to anybody listening to this that if you're going to go about being an entrepreneur, it's great to fly by the seat of your pants, but it's always you need a guiding framework, you need a guiding plan, um, and that was a key
Definitely.
to our
You have
success.
to find balance between that, right? Is that I think a lot of times people come in too stringent on one side or the other.
Yeah,
Either they're very, very restrictive to their plan. I've got a plan. I can't divert from it. I can't pivot from it. And we both kind of came up through the period where there was a lot of volatility.
right,
There wasn't, we went through and survived continuing resolution, sequestration,
right.
several BRAC initiatives, so that was a really, really kind of tough decade, the first 10 years of business where come year 5 or 7, you're like, "Oh my god," like, "Did I really make the right decision into, like, jumping into this sector?" Um, but the one thing that you mentioned that really kind of, like, resonates with me is the relationship part, and I know we spent a lot of time in those early years, building relationships, attending events, getting in front of as many people as possible and putting our best foot forward, but not to be transactional about it. And I'm so glad that you use the words deliberate. Because you have to be deliberate in who you meet with, why you're meeting with them. They're important people, they're busy people, and having like a really good game plan and understanding of like, why am I talking to you? Why, like, what can you benefit and how are you going to benefit? Can we mutually benefit from this conversation and these relationships? Because I think a lot of times, new people in this industry are very transactional. They treat me in a very transactional way. And I kind of figure if you treat me this way, I'm not open to introducing you to, my contacts or anyone in the government because I don't want you to treat another partner or someone, in the same manner.
That's right.
And so kind of recognizing that aspect of relationship building, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's just like, uh, leaning into being a genuine, being genuine and not, um, and sort of as you described, if you treat things transactionally, it's just not going to go well. And I've had many conversations where folks are looking for mentorship, and it was even during the CollabraLink run, and you could just tell that this wasn't something that it was something that the person across the table was maybe treating transactionally, and it's an immediate turnoff. Like you don't want to engage that
Hmm.
when you get approached that way. And so, yeah, I mean, I was out there to really try to build meaningful professional relationships all across the board, and that really, really benefited us tremendously.
Yeah, no, exactly. So which I think this is a great segue into our next segment, which is the turning point. And I know as a CEO, we've talked about being able to pivot and navigate some of the highs and lows. And during your tenure there, it definitely had several highs and many, many more, like other lows too. But there were turning points, and I think each one of those kind of sets its own challenges and opportunities. But can you share with our intellectuals some of the pivotal moments with us, and like what failures and successes kind of defined some of those turning points, and how did they shape your outlook and your decisions moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many of these, like you described, turning points that occur on an entrepreneurial journey. And sometimes you don't even realize it in the moment. It's like only in
Mm,
retrospect that you can look back and say, oh, wow, that was a big inflection
yeah.
point for us, or that was a big sort of pivot. And so I've had time now to like reflect on those things. And I can point to very specific moments. I mean, number one was the moment that I told you about earlier, where we were a commercial firm. We weren't a federal firm. And then all of a sudden, Motorola shut down our project and was like,
Mhm.
go, I needed to go figure it out. And that was a huge pivot point and a huge turning point in, the direction and existence of CollabraLink and whether or not it would exist. So, that was just being adaptable and having grit and just saying, okay, like I told you earlier, this thing that we tried didn't work. Now let's go try this thing, right? And so I really learned from that this notion of, not everything that you put on your board and your strategy kind of strategic plan and you go on to execute against is going to have is going to be successful, and that's okay. But you got to be able to quickly then change direction. That was a huge pivot point for us. Another pivot point was that first contract win was so pivotal. And I remember it to this day. I mean, I bid without any business I had no business bidding on this deal, but I found an Appian deal on the GSA schedule for the Army. I didn't even realize it was full and open. I didn't even know what that was at the time, right? And I submitted this bid. This is 3 months after getting my GSA schedule in May 2009. And I won a deal at the Army for 3 developers for 6 months. And I was like immediately then put aside any and all growth and business development related initiatives. And I just went deep into like delivery,
Mm,
because I knew, like, just intuitively, that if you deliver, it will create more growth, right? It will drive organic growth. Like a happy customer is sort of the best driver of growth. And so that was pivotal for us, because it's like once you get that first win and you actually deliver, it can turn into a snowball, right? It can turn into a snowball rolling downhill. And that was very pivotal for us. Another pivotal point was it was probably a 2011 timeframe, and now we'd gotten some momentum, we'd gotten some growth. I was probably at 25 employees at the time, and we found a deal that was a recompete of a $50 million contract for the Department of Education called EdWeb. And it was all their web development work for the Department of Education. And I remember looking at this, my business development team brought it to us, and I was like, this thing is way too big for us. Like, I don't know. It was a single award, 50 million. I was like, I don't know how we're going to, like, can we do this? Like, are we even
there's the
prepared?
pessimist coming out.
Yeah. But then there was this moment of clarity where it was like, nothing's impossible here. And first of all, I feel like we're doing difficult stuff today. We can do this. Like, we can band
Yeah.
together as a team and figure it out. And so we bid this $50 million contract at the Department of Education. ActionNet was the incumbent. We went into the orals and absolutely knocked their socks off and won the deal. And it was hugely pivotal for me as a leader, because I thought, oh my gosh, you know, I now realize that aiming high is kind of what you have to do every single day.
Yep.
And then and there was a thing that I felt, right? At the time, I felt fear. I felt fear of, like, what if, like we can't deliver? What if we fail, right? I don't know if we should bid this. I realized that the other learning from that was, like, you have to lean into that fear, right? when you feel that fear, it means you're trying to do something big, and that's good. And so
Hmm.
continue chasing that and continue pursuing that. So that was another kind of key learning from that pivotal point for me. There were others, of course, but those are the ones that sort of jump out at me as the most memorable. Because then from there, like once we started bidding bigger and bigger deals, the business started growing and incrementally kind of
Yeah.
stepping up every year.
So I love the fact that you shared the oh shit moment, like, oh my God, we won. And like now what, right? Because that is definitely one of the um, the lessons that I always try to coach my clients is grow responsibly, but always be mindful that you need to kind of scale for that growth, right? So I'm all for shooting for the stars and but be careful what you ask for because if you really pursue things in a way that you want to win them, you're going to win them. It's just like it's the universe. You put out in the universe what you want. The universe is always going to give you back and reflect to you what you need and what they want to give you. But the other great part of the stories that you're telling me is that and I totally believe this, is that small businesses do not need to rest on their laurels on set asides and sole sourcing. You can compete. You
Yeah,
should try to compete. And I love the fact that your win was a full and open. You're like, I have no idea what that is. But
right.
it shouldn't matter, what it is. But obviously, now that because you bid and then won other and probably have lost others, too, that you thought that you should have won, is that you do have at least have some awareness of your competitive intel or what your value proposition is. Like going into an opportunity, you can't just say, "Hey, we're great, trust me," right? Like you have to be scrappy. You have to be very, insightful and deliberate in how you portray and demonstrate that you're able to meet these requirements. And obviously, you were able to do that better than the incumbent was, which kudos to you on that one because
Yeah.
incumbents can't be beat. And I say it all the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And some of that,
So,
some of what I benefited from, Ton, early on there was this just sheer I guess being sheerly or like, I was a newbie to federal. I didn't understand federal, but that benefited me because I didn't have to follow
mhm,
sort of the herd. And the herd was just, sort of naysayers, and they were, you got to get some contract work. You have to like just latch onto some prime and beg for scraps. And that's where the herd was going. And I was like, I don't feel like doing that. I'm going to go ahead and start bidding stuff that I see
mhm.
on the TSA schedule because I feel like we could do it. And so a little of that was ignorance, to be honest, but I'm so glad I came at it from that sort of like, more, kind of outsider mindset because it really worked well.
Yeah, I've never been part of the herd, and so I'm like that random sheep that always tries to, like get away. And that's just kind of how I roll. And it drives my mother crazy because, I think your dad and I would get along quite well because we probably share a lot of the same same approaches to things.
Right.
Um,
That was
so yeah, so moving from like your day-to-day operations at CollabraLink, obviously you've got some new ventures and passions, and you've embraced now a role since your early retirement from CollabraLink. And I know we've talked a lot about you being an investor and an advisor and focusing on more philanthropy and giving back. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of your new ventures and how do you choose what startups or what initiatives to advise on? And what projects in philanthropy you're passionate about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I guess just to for the listening audience to kind of give a synopsis of my my journey and the conclusion in 2022, or actually it was at December 30th, 2021. But basically, the start of 2022, I sold CollabraLink to a private equity buyer who bought majority stake, and they also brought in two operating partners who were very seasoned veterans, one of whom I transitioned the CEO function to. So now I sit on the board at what is now called Groundswell. It has been rebranded. So I sit on the board, and we'll have a coffee here and there with our CEO. who is fantastic, an amazing guy. And, kind of keep close-ish tabs on the business, but I'm no longer operational. And that's sort of a great feeling. That was always the end goal, was it's, I don't know that this was the right way to do it, but when I started CollabraLink, and when, as I was building it, I always had the idea in mind that we would get to an exit and that we would sell, right? And like I said, I don't know if that's the right way to do it. It was just the way that, it's sort of shaped for myself and for CollabraLink. But what I'd say to folks that are thinking along those same lines, it's incredible. Now I'm here on the other side of the table. I've sold the business, and I've sort of quote unquote climbed the proverbial mountain. But I look back and I'm like, wow, I really miss that. I really miss the journey, and I really miss the the day-to-day teamwork that it took, almost the locker room, that you have to be in with your team, building this business. And so that's something that I'll share, just for what it's worth, with, aspiring GovCon entrepreneurs, is that when you sell, it's not as Hollywood of an ending as you maybe think, right? Now, I do have.
You don't get your Oscar. You don't get your Oscar and be like, oh.
I have it right here. There's my Oscar. This is the deal tombstone right here that you get from your investment bank after you sell.
There you go.
But I have all these newfound time to spend on a bunch of new ventures and passions, as you described, and I love it. It's a great feeling, and you feel very liberated to be able to do that. And so, I'm doing a lot of different things. I'm first of all spending a ton more time with my children and my wife. I have 3 little kids, and so it's really important to me to have this time to kind of reconnect with them and be close to them. I'm coaching basketball for my kids, which I really enjoy. I started doing some writing, so I actually wrote a 3-part medium article on the CollabraLink journey. I haven't published it yet because I haven't gotten the courage up to put it out into the universe. But I wrote it, and I'm going to get somebody to edit it, and then I'll eventually put it out there. So I'm reading, I'm writing, I'm spending time with my kids. I'm reading a lot, finding a lot of joy and fulfillment in consuming, books. I'm exercising a ton. And I'm also spending some time doing some self-reflection and thinking about, like, what does a second act look like, if there is one, and what are the things I love, and what can I give back to the world? What is my quest as a human on this planet? What am I put here to do? And so these are the things I'm sort of working through, and I have a coach that I work with to try to help get answers to those questions. And then lastly, like you mentioned, I'm doing some advisory work. I found a few companies that, kind of, I think, are doing interesting things. And that's, you asked, what do I look at to decide who I'm advising? And it's sort of, for me, I want it to be something that's stimulating, something that's maybe new to me, where I'm learning, or I find that the approach, the thesis is interesting and novel. And that then gets me geeked up to say, hey, I want to support these guys, and let me try to, give them advice along the way. That's been sort of the framework that I've used to filter down into who it is that I'll sort of engage with from an advisory perspective. And then lastly, philanthropy. My wife and I, that's a joint thing that we're kind of navigating together. And the one thing I know for sure is, stroking a check is not nearly as satisfying to me as actually doing something with my hands, like hands-on, right? And we obviously will write checks, but we want to sort of get ourselves immersed in some level of volunteerism and things like that. And so we're navigating finding that right organization for us to kind of affiliate with, to really spend our time. and energy with. And so I would say right now we have a handful of different organizations that we're writing checks to, and that we're feeling very inspired by their causes. But we're also still like in the process of figuring out where can we really dig in and get our hands dirty and actually do some volunteer work ourselves, and have that be something that we do as not only her and I, but with our family and with our kids. So that's an ongoing journey.
Yeah. No, and you are way too young for us to be putting you back out to pasture, you know. You can't be like a man of leisure, like all day. I know that your wife probably is like, could you please go and do something, find something to do. But is there a CollabraLink 2.0? Do you see yourself maybe, like if something really piques your interest or a new technology or, like could you do this again? Because I know that a lot of entrepreneurs are serial entrepreneurs where they see a new opportunity and you're like, yes, I can get behind that. Let's do this again. Would it be in the GovCon sector, or do you think you would go off and do something totally different?
I mean, so I really have thought a lot about that of late. And I mean, I think you're right. Like I'm 45. And so the idea of like being a man of leisure, being retired doesn't suit me. When you go out and you play a bunch of golf and you're there on a Tuesday and it's like it's me and a bunch of 80-year-olds, you realize like, okay, I probably don't belong here. Like I probably have more to give, and I don't need to be in the country club on a Tuesday at like 11 a.m. having lunch with a bunch of octogenarians.
Wimbledon, right? Like there's only so much tennis that you can watch, right?
Yeah, and so I mean, I'm definitely thinking a lot about that. I don't think it's funny that you say CollabraLink 2.0. I think the one thing I am really trying to do is not try to replicate what we did at CollabraLink. I'm not trying to build a 2.0. I just don't think that that's my I don't think I would feel passionate about that. I think what I've sort of really self-reflected on is that now I have the opportunity to build something where we don't have to anchor off of financial gain or monetary sort of achievement. It's more anchored off of impact, and how can I have impact on missions that are important to me. And so directionally, my thinking is that if I were to start something again, like it's going to have a little bit more narrow of a focus and not be such a big generalist IT modernization style company. There are technologies that I get really excited about. I mean, I'm spending a decent amount of time now, doing self-study and attending panels and discussions on AI, leveraging AI, Gen AI, to sort of move these missions forward for the government. And so, yeah, I mean, I think government and government contracting would likely be the area that I would pursue, because from an impact perspective, that's where I feel like I can really, drive impact on important missions. And so it's still all squishy, and I'm still figuring it all out. But I feel like I have a general sense of directionally where I want to go.
Yeah. So I think that this is a really great transition into our last segment here about challenges and missteps. And so, with all of this wisdom and lessons learned that you've navigated through CollabraLink's ascent and the ventures beyond there, you've mentioned this a little bit too, is that you're kind of in a prime position to guide the next generation of leaders, the emerging leaders, the next set of CEOs. What advice, besides what we've kind of I've had a couple of conversations um, with guests where they're like, if I could tell my younger self this would be something that I would say. But what key lessons, I think, do you think are essentials, and what principles for anyone who's looking to lead a company in this new landscape? Because the landscape of the CEOs now is very different than
Right.
when you came up. The technology, the rapid pace of movement. contracting is different now too. There's the huge contracting vehicles, whereas before, if you had a GSA schedule, you had an 8A, or you had some, like a small business set aside. Obviously that's kind of all you needed. Now there's so many different licenses to hunt. There's so many different things that are out there. And in some ways it's kind of easier, but it's also kind of harder, like at the same time too. But industry, I think, is more sophisticated than I think where we were before. There's a lot of really smart CEOs that are out there, but it becomes really difficult, I think, for companies to differentiate themselves, to kind of set themselves apart or different from, let's say, the herd, right? Like, how do you differentiate yourself? Like, so, I don't know. Do you have any like life lessons or, advice
Yeah, I mean
for
that's
up and
things.
coming companies?
That, yeah, definitely. I mean that's one of the things that these last year and a half, 2 years have afforded me is this ability to kind of look back and self-reflect and think about what are the lessons that came out of that journey. And I mean, obviously, I was trying to be cognizant of those things in the moment. But when you're building a company and it's growing rapidly, you're sort of buried in it, and so it's hard to like have the clarity. And so now I've had some time to have the clarity, and I think there's some very tactical things that I'll sort of maybe start with, because they're a little easier. Number one, um, I was intentional and deliberate, and I'm so grateful for this about finding my my bliss, finding my zen. And for me, and that was like while I was CEO, while I was running the company. And what I mean by that is I carved out, and I didn't do all this right from the beginning. Some of it evolved over time, over the journey, but almost right away, my 12 o'clock lunch hour, I carved out for myself, and that was my workout. And I would go every day to work out. And so I would tell you that one of the key pieces of wisdom I would share with an aspiring CEO is take care of yourself, because there
It's
is nothing.
hard.
Yeah, there's no. But I literally would tell my BD team, and I'd block off on my calendar 12 to 1, and I would go for a run or I'd go for a swim. And it was so critical, because if you maintain your physical health, it helps you maintain your mental health. Another thing I added in, later was I started meditating, because it's, being a CEO is a very lonely journey, or it can be,
Yep.
and it's very taxing. And so I had to, build my mental resiliency, and meditation and transcendental meditation is a tool that I use to do that, and it was really impactful. So those things were huge. Another tactical item was read. I read a lot during my journey. There are so many books full of so much wisdom on all of these topics that we've discussed. Like one of the things I often reminded myself of was I am not the first guy to try to build a successful business. So many people have done this before. So let me go out and consume and read as much as I can about what it takes. And so some of my readings were biographies of CEOs, or some of it was philosophy. I mean, I would just go out and read as much as I could, because it just helped to shape my worldview. It helped to shape kind of the way I was tackling the problems that we faced, and it just gave me solace in understanding and knowing that there are other folks out here who have crossed some of these same challenges that I'm trying to cross, right? And so that was
Also,
yeah.
so it's also gives you some good perspective too, is that I know that a lot of times, and I don't know if it's a generational thing or if it's where we are moving in society, but there are some who are so wrapped around the axle about making sure that you believe what they believe, or and if you don't subscribe to their approach or their vision or whatever, that somehow you're against them, or somehow that you're totally off the mark or whatever. And so I don't like to read. So and people are like, oh yes, Ton, you do read. I just read differently. I can't read books. I don't have like the patience for it. But I like am always trying to absorb a lot of different things. And so what I like to subscribe to is being able to kind of view, read, or listen to um, counter thoughts, people who don't agree with me, people who have like the opposite view of what I might have, because I think it really helps you kind of be able to formulate and validate and test your thoughts, your theories, your knowledge about what it is that you know or what you're trying to, instruct or subscribe to other people, if you kind of see both sides to it. And so,
Yeah,
it's like I don't always kind of subscribe to reading and viewing and like absorbing things that are kind of like drinking my own Kool-Aid
yeah,
type of perspective, because I don't think that makes you a very well-rounded kind of person. So yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
I hear you on that one.
I think that like there are other ways to read, right? It's like podcast, listen to podcasts, read short articles. Find people that are like you said, either have counter thoughts or are like exploring an area you're interested in. I mean, it doesn't have to be books, but there if you can incorporate reading into your journey as a CEO, I found it hugely helpful. There's books like Shoe Dog, there Steve Jobs, Shoe Dog's the Phil Knight book. Steve Jobs is obviously about Apple and Steve Jobs. There's a book that I love called The Hard Thing About Hard Things by the guy who's Ben Horowitz, who's now with Andreessen Horowitz. And, that's a book about him building his first business and how many pivots they had and the grit that they showed. So there's some of these amazing books out there that really, help. And then in terms of gaining perspective, I mean, this is nerdy, but I read philosophy. I read books like, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius or Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday. These kinds of things give you perspective and help you understand that these challenges that you're facing are not existential, and they are things that others have faced in the past before and have like navigated successfully. I mean, those are things that have helped me along my journey. And then, another couple of key takeaways that I would relay here for any listener is that number one, failure is part of the process. It's just going to happen, and you have to be okay with like sort of navigating it. And number two, curveballs are a constant. That is, without a doubt. And those things may sound cliche, but like, what I mean by that is the curveball piece. Initially when I started CollabraLink and we were small, it'd be like one curveball a quarter, right? Some key personnel would quit, and I'd have to replace them. And then as we got bigger, it was like once a month, and then it was twice a month, and then eventually it was like you were getting curveballs like once a week, and it was like things like a key employee decided to resign, and you had to replace them. A client was upset about something. There's an interpersonal conflict between two executives. Whatever. There was curveballs constantly coming at me as the business scaled, and so just becoming accustomed to understanding that that's going to happen, and in fact, that is the job, is managing the curveballs. Like when things are steady state, you're sort of not being when things are steady state, you're sort of not being challenged. But when these curveballs come, that's sort of what you're in the seat for. That's where where you as CEO need to kind of step up. And then on the failure as part of the process piece, I mean, we had many failures. They were all very devastating to me in the moment. But as I look back on them, and I can kind of like connect the dots in retrospect. They all led me to where I landed, which was a big $70+ million business that had 300+ employees. And so failure is going to happen, and often it's like in an entrepreneurial journey, it's like one step forward, two steps backwards, two steps forward, one step backwards. So you got to come out of those failures with postmortems, lessons learned, things that you change and that you do differently, and kind of adjust based on. And that's the key. It's like it's going to happen. Learn from it. Figure out what you're going to do differently on the next go round, and keep moving forward. That's another key takeaway for me from like my entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah. I call that embracing the suck,
Yeah.
because it's gonna be the title of my next book. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where, I feel if I'm not pushing the envelope, if I'm not doing something that makes me a little uncomfortable or uncertain with myself, then I'm kind of in this very O&M kind of, mode where I'm on autopilot. And it's just not rewarding. I think it's a personality thing with CEOs is that you have to always be pushing the envelope. You always have to be exploring something new. I find sometimes I have ADD because it's like, oh my God, I just finished a thought, or I have people, and you must have people like this, is I'll call someone and be like, okay, tell me this is a really bad idea because I'm thinking I want to do this. And they're like, no. Or they'll tell me, yes, that's a bad idea. But a lot of times it's like, no, that's great. That's, like, okay, are you sure? And that, as much as I'm super optimistic all the time, I teach my son this all the time instead of saying, well, when we win. And I'm like, he's like, he doesn't even say that. He goes, well, when we win,
Mhm.
and when we get there it's going to be this, and so he's already kind of manifested
Yeah.
the positive outcome for it, and that's kind of how I'm always seeing things too. But yeah, everyone, when, like you said, when you're in that moment, and I remember when I lost my first employee, and it sucked so bad. It was just like, oh my God, I felt rejected. I was like, what do you mean you don't want to work here anymore? And you just, all you want to do is like keep them, or, like make them like not leave you because you need them, or, they were a great contributor to your team. But like looking back, and at the end of the day, it was the best thing for them. And so, like, as the next curveball, like you said, comes along, it makes kind of pivoting or responding to them much easier because now you kind of know how that feels. And after that initial knee jerk reaction of like, oh my God, like, let me take that all in and like, okay, we can do this, right? Like, okay, I can see a pathway, through this. But it takes a moment when you're in the moment.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you sort of like uh, you have to absorb the gut punch, kind of catch your breath, and then tackle it. Right, wrestle the problem to the ground is kind of the way I would frame it up for my team. It's like, okay, we're in wrestling stance. Let's go wrestle this new thing that just popped up. Right, this client. For example, we had a bid back in the day at Homeland that we had been shaping forever, big $100+ million deal, and we felt very, very well positioned. We got it onto a vehicle that we knew we could bid on it, and all of a sudden, in the 11th hour, in the middle of the procurement, the government added a small piece of modification to the solicitation that said you have to recertify as a small business in order to be eligible for award. And we are just like, oh my God, because we couldn't recertify. And we've been pursuing this for over a year, right? So much time and energy and capture dollars spent on this. And, I was like, initially that was a gut punch. And then we just went to work. We wrestled it, and we kind of laid out, here are the things we're going to do. Here's who we're going to talk to. This is what we're going to do. And divvied it up and conquered as a team. And we got that clause taken out. So it's just kind of adapting and having that resiliency and saying, okay, it's a curveball. It sucks. Let's go tackle it.
Yeah. Someone got in there and influenced somewhere. It
Yes.
wasn't me, I swear. That one was not me. So
That one's I
um
that's always a tough one
that
to.
one hurt. Yes, I know. So these are such incredibly valuable takeaways. I'm so glad that you're able to share your stories and these insights. And a lot of these stories are similar stories of your peers. And this is exactly why I wanted to start the C Suite series on the different level executives, because I think it's important to kind of get into the mindset and to hear directly from each of the executives, some of the challenges and some of the thinking and what shaped them um, in their positions.
Right.
And it's like you said, it's an often lonely road, but it can be so rewarding, like at the same time. But I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and journeys with us. And I appreciate you speaking very candidly and taking time out of your busy, leisurely day, with us to discuss with our intellectuals. And, I wish you the very best in what's next for you. And I hope that you'll keep me posted. And if there's any part that I can be in that 2.0 phase of your life, I would love to be able to collaborate with you again and hear all about it.
Yeah, thank you, Ton. I'm so grateful for the chance to be on the show here. It's been fun. And I was just saying, when you were saying I have to return to my life of leisure, I was like, I have a yoga class that I have to attend in about 30 minutes, and so yeah, I'm gonna get out of here and get my workout in. But yeah, it's been fun, and I enjoyed chatting with you, and you know, looking forward to the response to this podcast.
Thank you so much. And thanks again to our intellectuals listening here today. Remember, you have to think big to win big, be an intellectual. And until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of possibilities.